The great thing about Barack Obama is that his election was actually the end of racism in the United States, and everything is fine now. Welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome back. We're going to talk about how everything is totally fine and normal today. We are, of course, tackling chapters 5 and 6 in Angela Davis's Freedom is a Constant Struggle, and that means we're going to talk about progress. How do we define progress? Now, originally, I teased this a little bit in the last video. Originally, I was also going to talk today about the designation of terrorist. What does it mean that we apply this term to people, and how has this term come to have so much power? I'm actually shifting that stuff to next week just because as I was writing this script today, I was kind of looking at it and thinking, actually, there's a lot to think and talk through today, and I like to keep these videos kind of short and reasonably friendly. So I'm shifting that to next week. Don't worry, I know this is something, the terrorist designation, Assata Shakur, all of this is stuff that runs through the entire book. There's never a wrong time to talk about it. I'm just picking next week's video where we cover chapters 7 and 8, if I'm doing my math right. So we will talk about that, but just not today. Today we're going to stick to this question of what is progress. We're going to talk about the problem of the election of Barack Obama. What does it mean? The ways that we try to tease apart symbolism from actual significance, all of this stuff. So we're jumping right back into this book. Before we get into anything, a quick reminder, as always, to like, subscribe, comment, all that great stuff. Check out the Patreon channel, patreon.com/champagneanarchism. We've got a lot more stuff there. We got a movie series over there. We have a 100 Great Anarchist Thinkers series over there, where we are digging into the diggers most recently. So we're going to talk about a lot of that stuff over there. And all of this main feed stuff is absolutely free. You can subscribe to get more stuff, but this main feed stuff where we get into the books, I want to keep that free for everybody just because I think this is information that everybody should have. Everybody should know about these incredible books that we're reading through. And Angela Davis's Freedom is a Constant Struggle is no exception. Normally, this is the part in the video where I give you a little roadmap. I say we're going to talk about this, this, and this, and this is the structure for the video. Today, because we are limiting our scope to just this one thing, there's no roadmap. We're just going to jump right in. And let's talk about the Barack Obama problem. Barack Obama was elected in 2008. I remember it well. I am very old. If you don't remember it well, let me tell you, it's a little tough to describe exactly how breathless the coverage of this moment in history was. And it's something that comes up in this book repeatedly. She's asked about Barack Obama. She volunteers her opinions on Barack Obama. So there's a lot to talk about with Barack Obama and this symbolic moment of the United States, this former slave-based economy electing a black man as president. There were people on television seriously arguing, they truly believed this, that this was a signal that the United States was about to embark on a new period in history, a post-racial period. This was the heralding event for a new post-racial United States. There was something about this election that has supposedly taken us to the promised land, right? This is the dream of people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks. This is what they were fighting for, a black man in a position of power. It was easy back then to kind of get swept up in the moment and all of this momentum. It was a pretty brutal, although we've seen much worse now, but it was at the time a very brutal election cycle. There was a lot said, a lot of racist nonsense on the news media, if you can imagine that. And it did kind of feel at the time like the United States had turned some kind of corner. It had managed somehow to maybe close a chapter in this particularly evil racist history that the United States has known for hundreds of years. But you know who wasn't swept along by all of this election momentum and fervor? our friend Angela Davis. You'll see Davis talk about Barack Obama several times in this book, and it's because Barack Obama was a titanic figure, remains actually a titanic figure, a hugely important figure just in American history, right? It is symbol, of course, but it's also a little bit more than that, because Barack Obama was very much what a lot of people were fighting for, and then we turned around and realized exactly what was happening under the Obama presidency. And it is because Barack Obama ultimately, because of who he was and the conditions that he was in, he spectacularly failed the people who expected him to be a real break from the history of the United States as it was. And we actually learned that pretty quickly in his first administration, right? We're talking the mass bailout of Wall Street banks with zero consequences of basically any kind for anybody who was involved, to taking us to the brink of global financial ruin. We're also talking about the massive expansion of drone strikes over Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, with enormous civilian casualties without really any oversight. Barack Obama also very famously broke his promises to end the war in Afghanistan and close Guantanamo Bay, the detention facility over there. And then, of course, there were his fairly half-hearted efforts where he tried to deal with his campaign promises on things like prisons and policing. You had a half-baked healthcare reform, although that wasn't necessarily entirely his fault. He did try, at least with that one, and there was a little bit of something. His words about racial equality, but his lack of legislative action, there's a lot to complain about Barack Obama's 2 terms in the presidency. And very quickly after his election, it became quite clear that Barack Obama was by no means the savior that everybody had expected him to be. That is to say, the United States was not about to enter a post-racial period anytime soon. And I know we're covering chapters 5 and 6 today, but I want to draw your attention back to the first chapter in this entire book. Davis says in that first chapter, many of the assumptions regarding the significance of Obama's election are entirely wrong, especially those that depict a black man in the US presidency as symbolizing the fall of the last barrier of racism. That may seem fairly obvious to you, especially I'm recording this video in 2025. It should seem obvious to us that that was not the answer to really anything. Just installing a black person in a position of power does not solve any of the underlying problems, no matter its symbolic significance. But at the time, it really felt, and a lot of people came out and said, that this was the fall of the last barrier of racism. This was the post-racial future that everybody had been waiting for. And Angela Davis is just pointing out in this book that came out in 2016 that that was ridiculous the whole time. So when we talk about the Barack Obama problem, the problem has 2 parts. On the one hand, as Angela Davis does point out, Barack Obama's election did have tremendous symbolic significance. It ultimately showed that with major grassroots effort and organizing and campaigning and all of the dedication of so many volunteers on the ground who went out to knock on doors and really believed in this candidate, this young senator from Illinois, that something could happen, that change was actually possible. It demonstrated, in other words, the fact that it was possible to break the unbroken line of old white men in the White House. And that may sound a little ridiculous, and of course, yes, sure, but it really meant something and continues to mean something. The fact that you actually can change the outcome through elections, it's not nothing, right? The other thing is, and we should be very clear on this because Angela Davis says, listen, you can fight both battles, right? You can fight it in the elections, and you can also build structures based on mutual aid outside of that. You can do both. We should be very clear here that Barack Obama was almost without question the best president of my lifetime. Now, that is not a particularly high barrier. My life, in fact, starts in the Clinton administration. So it's not that you don't have to work that hard to become the best president of my lifetime. But there were real changes that occurred during the Barack Obama presidency that we should take into account. And Angela Davis is fundamentally a political pragmatist in this respect. She says, listen, you put people in office that will respond to you when you put pressure on them. And that is very politically pragmatic, and we should take her very seriously in that. So we have to be honest here that Barack Obama, for all of his spectacular failures, and there were for many, he was the best of a host of terrible options. So fair enough. So that's the first part. There were benefits, symbolic and real, to Barack Obama's presidency, but the second part is a little bit darker. Because the thing is, and Davis is very clear on this, simply inserting a black person, or any person, into the existing power structure does not change the fact that that power structure exists, and doesn't change the power structure really at all. It may, at best, soften the blows of the power structure. It may also make it easier for people who we care about to exist in the world. That's undeniably true. But it's not fundamental change by any means. So we have to ask ourselves the question then. If the election of Barack Obama wasn't true progress, what is true progress? What is it? How do we measure it? And why is electing the first black president in the history of the United States completely insufficient? Angela Davis has this line that I absolutely love, where she says, there are more than 900 streets named after Dr. King, but there are also some 2.5 million people in U.S. jails, prisons, youth facilities, military prisons, and jails in Indian country. And this is Davis flicking at this idea that progress is well beyond the symbolic. Sure, it's very nice to celebrate a civil rights icon like Martin Luther King Jr., but that is insufficient for progress. Progress is so much more. And does it matter if we have all these streets named after MLK Jr., if very little has actually changed? And let's ask ourselves another related question here, which is, why are there so many streets named after MLK Jr.? And Angela Davis is about to answer this for us. Davis has this argument that runs throughout the book that the way that we talk about the civil rights movement and U.S. history in general makes it sound like a few people stood up very bravely to fight and protest peacefully and within the bounds of proper protest, and that ignorant people fought against them. And of course, that eventually the United States, especially the white United States, came around. It gives the impression that there were a handful of people driving meaningful change, and that after this period, that period of history is closed. Things changed, now we're better. Neither of those things is true. In fact, Martin Luther King Jr. remaining the dominant figure obscures the fact that people driving the change at the time were from an incredibly broad movement. A movement that was often driven by black female domestic workers more than it was these leading lights that we now hold up and celebrate as icons of the civil rights movement. And it is precisely these black female domestic worker movements, these collective group of people that fought anonymously against the power structure, that history has taken so many pains to erase. And there's a second part of this, which is that even the members of this movement that we do choose to elevate, we elevate a very sanitized version of them. Davis says, for example, that everybody, at least in the United States, knows about MLK Jr.'s "I have a dream" speech. But few people know about his Riverside Church speech on Vietnam, where he connected the struggle of black Americans within the United States to the campaign to end the war in Vietnam. I am not the first person to say this. Angela Davis is not the first person to say this, but Martin Luther King Jr. was a radical socialist revolutionary. But you absolutely would not know that if you read the prescribed history books in high school that I had to read. The other strange thing here, when you look at those history books, is that we tend to elevate white people in these struggles. In Chapter 5, in the space of a very short speech, Angela Davis argues that Abraham Lincoln didn't end slavery. Black slaves fighting and doing what she and W.B. Du Bois describe as a general strike, right? Transferring their labor from the South to the North is what won the war and ended slavery. But if you read an American history book, you will read that Abraham Lincoln ended slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation. He absolutely did not. This was not one moment either. This was not driven by one man. This wasn't even driven by one black man. This was a movement. That's just how history works. These simply are not struggles that were won by white people. They weren't even struggles that were won by a handful of particularly luminous black people. These were ultimately collective struggles that were fought across the spectrum by luminous leaders and organizers, absolutely, but also by black women, by domestic workers, by students, by Black Panthers, by bus passengers. and in one very famous march during the civil rights struggle by literal children. Davis references the Children's Crusade a couple times and says how effective it was. The civil rights struggle and the Civil War and numerous struggles across American history were fought by radicals, by communists and Marxists and prisoners and designated terrorists. And we'll talk about that designation again next week. And it was also fought by an interconnected network of people across the political spectrum and around the world. And that's something that we should not lose sight of. We'll talk a little bit about this in the final video that I'm going to make on this video when we cover chapters 9 and 10. And more than all of this, there is a second lie to this story that we're normally told, and it is that these struggles were ultimately won. And this is normally how this story goes, right? We fought these struggles in the past, we won, and now we're different. And Angela Davis is here to tell us, no. Actually, we haven't. Victories were won. Absolutely, there were victories in this struggle, but the struggle is ongoing. When you look at something like the massive expansion of the prison system and the way that it targets Black people and minorities, to say nothing, by the way, of the rise of the security state and global violence, which is violence being displaced so that capitalism can continue its rampant process of extracting. In many ways, when you look at these elements, we are actually losing ground in some of these struggles. In some ways, we are in fact far worse off than we were in the 1960s during this period of intense struggle and radical politics. And we are not helped in any of this by the fact that our revolutionary heroes and icons can be held up by the power structure and turned against us. The reason that we know this non-violent version of Martin Luther King Jr., this sanitized version of this revolutionary icon, is because it benefits the power structure, the elites, and those currently holding on to power for us to think that protest is non-violent and quiet. If we can be sold this idea that all Martin Luther King Jr. was fighting for was the right for more Black people to become billionaires, then we have lost, because that's not progress. And if we believe that it's progress, then it is actually sufficient to name a bunch of streets after Martin Luther King Jr. and maybe erect some statues. Because if his legacy that we remembered was anything other than the sanitized version, that would not be possible. In this way, the legacy of truly revolutionary people who populate our history books completely, their legacy is turned against us because it is sanitized, it is cleaned up, and it is turned into something that is quietistic. We heard this word when we talked about Murray Bookchin a couple books ago, but it is ultimately to tell us the certain way, this certain prescribed way that we have of resisting power. And that prescribed way is not actually any real way to resist power. Not at all. So anytime you hear somebody trying to frame things like the election of Barack Obama as a major victory in the civil rights struggle, or as something heralding a post-racial future, and there will be more of these moments, they will come up, we will have symbolic victories, absolutely. I want you to think about Angela Davis. The struggle isn't over and anybody can oppress. This is something we know as well from the wretched of the earth. Black people can oppress, women can oppress, trans people can oppress. Anyone can oppress just as well. And if you can slot a symbolic victory into the existing power structure, you have just made that power structure that much more potent and that much more powerful. What progress really is meaningful change for vulnerable people. That really is what progress looks like. Now, there may be some of that, some elements of that will count as victories from these giant symbolic victories. There are things, we said this at the beginning, that Barack Obama definitely changed, that made lives easier for the people that we care about, that are little moments, little helpful things that we now have in this longer struggle towards a significantly better future, some actual, real fundamental change. Those are things that we can celebrate, and we should celebrate them. But until we truly have meaningful, fundamental change on protecting the more vulnerable people in society, until we have something beyond these little minor symbolic victories, until we see any of that, don't tell me about the post-racial future that's been ushered in by Barack Obama. Now, as always, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think. Do you disagree with any of this? Am I being too kind to the legacy of Barack Obama? Or maybe am I being too mean to Barack Obama? I don't know. It could be. Let me know. And as always, thank you so much for watching. If you are already a subscriber to the Patreon channel, thank you so much for being there. Your support really means everything. It helps me keep all of this main feed stuff free for anybody who wants it. It is really, really awesome that you're there. Thank you. Check out the Patreon. Like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. And I will see you next week, because next week we are talking all about the designation of terrorism and what counts as a woman. So it's a light week next week. Don't worry about it. I'll see you then.